Buddhism and Western philosophy and religion and Pali, so that now we know him already. On together, we are praying together. Start now. Alahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Bhagavan Abhivaden Sawakato Bhagavata Mo Dhamma Namasami Supatipa Bhagavato Sawakasa Sangkanamami Namo Tas Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Bhagavato Arahato Sambuddhassa Namo Bhagavato Arahato Sambuddhassa. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Yeah. On this day, we are invite Professor Dr. Premasiri from Sri Lanka at the subject on Tipitaka study, the concept of Nibbana in the Suttantapitaka. May invite him to lecture to us today, and thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have this interaction with the student group at your university. Actually, I have been asked to talk on a very important subject, that is about the ultimate goal of Buddhism. Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So I'm very glad to have this interaction with you, and I propose to talk on this topic for over 2 hours, and then also have some response from your side also for a few minutes, if it's possible. So let me begin my presentation. We are talking about a very significant topic. I would say that it is the most significant from the perspective of Buddhist doctrine, because it is Nibbana that we consider as the goal of all adherents of the Buddhist tradition. All those who follow the message of the Buddha actually aspire to attain this goal sooner or later. So the commitment may be different depending upon the individual concerned. And that is why I think there is a community which has been specially established to make an effort to attain this goal as early as possible. The monk community or the bhikkhu community who have renounced the pleasures of the sensuous world and try to live a life of simplicity, to abstain from the enjoyment of sensuous pleasures and strive to achieve this goal. Now, when we look at the Buddha's search, we find that as described in a discourse which is preserved in the Pali canonical tradition, which is called the Noble Search, the discourse on the Buddha's noble search. It is titled Arya Pariyesana Sutta. Arya means noble and Pariyesana means search. So in this discourse called the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, it is said that there are two kinds of persons. There are some people being themselves subject to the nature of repeated birth, old age, disease, death, grief, and defilement. Search for things that subject them to the same problems. So they are suffering from these problems, but they live a life searching for the same things. So they become repeatedly subject to this process of birth, old age, disease, and so on. And this is called by the Buddha the ignoble search. Ignoble search, anarya pariyesana. It is not a commendable search, a search which can be appreciated by us. The opposite is supposed to be the noble search, arya pariyesana. It is supposed to be the noble search. That is the search for what is not born, the incomparable or unsurpassable. The Pali word is anuttara, the unsurpassable. Safety from bondage. Yogakkema, safety from bondage. Nibbana. So that is how Nibbana has been described in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta as the unsurpassable safety from bondage. The Buddha entertained the hypothesis that there is a possibility of finding relief from this unsatisfactory predicament, the unsatisfactory situation that we have fallen into in our ordinary way of life. According to the Buddhist teaching, Nibbana becomes meaningful primarily due to the acceptance of the reality of a cyclic process of life. That is, we are trying to escape not from a situation which is limited to one lifetime, but it is supposed to extend over many future lifetimes, and it has existed for a long period in the past. We have gone through a long cycle of this process of birth, old age, disease, suffering. All these we have gone through for an extended period of time in the past, and there is also the future in which we have to go through this process. There is a sutta called Brahmajala Sutta, the net of Brahma. I think most Buddhist scholars and students are familiar with this because it is the first discourse in the Theravada, the first volume of the Theravada Pali canon, then it's Suttantapitaka. It is the first volume in the Suttantapitaka, the Digha Nikaya. It mentions about people who believed in Nibbana attained in this life itself. They refer to a kind of Nibbana called Ditta Dhamma Nibbana. Now, here I think we have to be clear about the point that even the Buddha talks about the attainment of Nibbana, not after a person passes away from this life, but in this life itself. But it is pointed out in this discourse of the Buddha that there were several theories about the attainment of Nibbana in this life itself. Divergent theories about the attainment of Nibbana in this life itself. And they explained it in 5 ways. There were 5 points of view expressed about the attainment of Nibbana in this life itself. At the lowest level, is the belief that Nibbana consists of the enjoyment of sensuous pleasures. So the more you gratify the sensuous pleasures, that is the kind of highest bliss, which is equivalent to Nibbanic bliss that we can experience in this life. But the Buddha criticized this viewpoint, saying that this sensuous gratification actually results in much more suffering than happiness in the long run. He pointed out the enjoyment of sensuous pleasures is productive of very little delight, but much anxiety and pain. Therefore, his advice was to leave aside any engagement in the unlimited sort of unlimited dedication to the enjoyment of sensuous pleasures. Then there were others who thought that this kind of enjoyment is a lower one, but there is a higher way of enjoying happiness. And during the Buddha's time, there were many contemplatives who have developed their minds by engaging in various methods of mind training. I believe the Digha Nikaya provides enough evidence. The Brahmajala Sutta also mentions persons who dedicated themselves to higher methods of mind training and even had the capacity to remember their previous life experiences. And they put forward many theories of liberation. They mistook certain attainments according to the Buddha's position. They mistook certain attainments to be the final end of suffering. But the Buddha pointed out that all those states of attainment, even though they are attained by rigorous methods of mental training, they are just impermanent states of being. A person who attains them falls away from those attainments and reverts to the life consisting of misery and all kinds of unsatisfactoriness. They thought that they had attained eternal life because they believed that the soul gets absorbed in these states, and the soul, after it passes away from this life, will remain in that state forever and attain eternal kind of being. Now we find that in the Buddha's teaching, the very belief in such a soul entity was challenged. The Buddha did not accept the idea that there is some eternal substance in us which can attain final liberation and attain what may be called immortality in that sense. So the Buddha did not believe in a kind of immortality of the self because he did not believe in a substantial Atman. The Buddha's attainment of liberation, which he called Nibbana, is usually described as Sabba Sankhara Samato. Sabba Sankhara Samato. That is the appeasement of all compounded things. Everything that has been volitionally constructed, everything that has come into being as compounded things. So the Buddha's aim was to achieve this appeasement of all volitional constructions, the compounded things. Sabbupadi patinissaggo, that means the renouncement, the abandonment of all tendencies to look for things that give sensuous delight. So that is why the Buddha, having reached the goal of Nibbana, qualified his attainment as one which is peaceful, excellent, santo panito. Those were the Pali words used. A peaceful attainment, an excellent attainment, it is not within the sphere of mere speculative reasoning. So the Buddha did not think that it is possible to achieve that goal by engaging in logic and reason. So he called it atakkavacharo, not subject to some kind of logical reasoning and understanding by that means, purely through speculation. And he called it subtle and also comprehensible only by the wise. It was further described as an attainment that ordinary people engrossed in the gratification of sensuous desires cannot easily understand. It is the appeasement of all dispositions, the tendencies in us, the kind of tendencies to attachment, or what has been previously conditioned, our involvement with things that have been previously conditioned, the abandoning of all mental pursuit of objects of desire, the abandonment of all mental pursuit of objects of desire. That is what is meant by sabbupadi patinissaggo. The term upadhi actually stands for things that we pursue and get attached to. We pursue things and then get attached to them, seeking happiness through them. So the Buddha is supposed to have abandoned all those tendencies. And the Buddha claimed to have attained this psychological transformation, realized the incorruptibility of mind that occurs with it, as well as a sense of freedom, happiness, and security experienced with this final end to all psychological ills. So the Buddha's attainment was actually one dealing with the psychological ills that a person generally goes through. Having discovered this state of wholesome transformation of personality, he instructed others on the effective means to attain it. So, according to the Pali Suttapitaka, there were thousands of disciples during the lifetime of the Buddha who were capable of following his instructions and who attained this goal. So we find that when the Buddha attained it, he made the claim that he became free of all bonds, whether those bonds are connected with the human world or the heavenly realms. He says, Mutto hang sabba pasehi ye dibba ye cha manusa. all bonds, whether they are heavenly or whether they are human. I am liberated from all of them. So when he made some disciples who became liberated in this manner, he calls upon them to go around, to go in different directions and give the message to others also to attain the same goal. So as time passed, fewer people were able to experience it by their own practice. There appears to have developed much speculative theories about its nature. Even during the time of the Buddha, those who speculated about it without directly experiencing it had problems regarding its nature. Some wanted to know whether one who attains it survives after death in some special realm, or whether such a person becomes extinct, that is, getting totally destroyed. The Buddha did not encourage speculation about such issues. Therefore, he often refused to answer questions about Nibbana that were unrelated to any person's immediate experience. The Buddha has made very positive statements about Nibbana that can be understood at the empirical or experiential level. So I will go into some of those descriptions that the Buddha has given in his teachings. Now, I will come to a very important point about the concept of Buddhist Nibbana as described in the Suttantapitaka. A distinguishing feature of the Buddhist concept of Nibbana as represented in the Pali Suttantapitaka is that it is a noun. The term Nibbana is a noun. But it is derived from a verbal form. Now, there are words in our language that have that character. Now, although it's not a very good example to compare with, now we talk about death. Now, death is a noun. But we can't talk about death apart from people who actually die. It is because people actually die that we talk about death. There is no realm called death, no special place, no special object, but it is used in our language to speak about a happening to someone in that person's life. There comes a point when one dies. Now, I believe that Nibbana is also very much the same, in the sense, not in the sense that Nibbana is death, but in the sense that it is, in terms of language, Nibbana does not represent anything, object, place, or something like that. It is something that happens to people in the way that death is something that happens to a person. Nibbana is also something that happens to a person. So it is a noun which is derived from a verb which expresses a happening. So there are many verbal forms related to the term Nibbana used in Buddhist sources. The past participle form Nibbuta is used. Nibbuto, Nibbayati. So this indicates that Nibbana is very different from other religious concepts. In other religious traditions, whether it is the Brahmanical tradition of India, the Vedic tradition of India, coming down from the Vedas, the Brahmanas, Upanishads, and so forth, or the Judeo-Christian tradition which talks about God and heaven, or even certain metaphysical traditions that talk about some kind of metaphysical absolute. I think in the Upanishads also they talk about a metaphysical absolute called Brahman, which is not a person, but an absolute kind of being. Now, Buddhism makes no reference to such phenomena or such realities. So, the Buddhist term Nibbana is a term, a noun derived from a verbal form, Nibbati or Nibbayati. So the language use suggests that it is a happening, but not a thing. There cannot be Nibbana apart from persons who attain it. That is a very important matter to realize. There cannot be Nibbana apart from persons who attain it. So Nibbana is not a kind of primordial being. It is not something that has existed from somewhere, from the beginning of existence, like the concept of Brahman in the Upanishads, or the concept of creator God in the Judeo-Christian religious traditions. So it is not a kind of primordial being from which everything else in existence is derived, or from which they evolve. It is not comparable to Brahman or Brahma in the Brahmanical religious tradition. In order to have a clear understanding of the concept of Nibbana, it is important to consider the Buddha's criticism of two extreme positions as theoretical explanations about the nature of reality. There were two extreme positions that the Buddha considered to be unacceptable as theoretical explanations about the nature of reality. These two theoretical extremes, apart from the theoretical extremes that have a role to play in the practical life of people, that is the extreme of the practical extreme of inflicting suffering on oneself with the intention of delivering the self from its tie with the body. So that was considered as the method followed, the practical method followed by those who depended on austere practices or practice of austerities, infliction of suffering on the body. The Buddha denied that extreme on the practical side. Then he also rejected the extreme called sensuous gratification. Now, these two practical extremes are also related to the theoretical extremes that were held by people at that time. The two theoretical extremes that are closely related to the practical extremes were what are described in the Buddhist sources as Sassatavada and Uchchedavada. So those who believed in Sassatavada thought that there is some absolute entity called the Atman, which has to be released from the body so that it can attain eternal life and be secure forever. The other extreme was that there is no such thing. We are just byproducts of matter. And when the material body gets destroyed, we are actually destroyed. So after that, we cannot talk about any kind of survival. We are annihilated. So that was the Uchchedavada extreme. The Nibbana Samyutta describes them as two extreme viewpoints called Attita. Attita means there is an absolute kind of existence which is eternal. That is the eternalist view, Attita. And the other is Nattita, that there is nothing substantial, everything ends with death. We cannot look for any kind of continuity, and that kind of view also doesn't make sense according to the Buddhist middle way viewpoint. So the Buddha not only presented a middle way teaching with regard to the practical life of people, but also a middle way teaching which is related to the theoretical understanding of the nature of reality. So in this context, the Buddha points out that a person who with right knowledge perceives the arising of things, the way things arise, depending upon conditions, such a person does not entertain the notion that everything is not, the nattita. There is nothing that exists. Because the Buddha points out, we can observe that things arise dependently. They don't stay eternally, but they arise dependently and they pass away, depending upon conditions. This is something that we can observe if we look closely at what is occurring before us. Similarly, a person who with right knowledge perceives the cessation of things, that things don't stay forever, they pass away, such a person does not entertain the notion that everything is. So a person who observes the arising of things does not entertain the belief that everything is not. And the person who observes the passing away of things does not entertain the belief that everything is eternally existing. So this is what the Buddha wanted people to understand. The concept of Nibbana cannot be understood in isolation from other key doctrines of Buddhism. Sometimes the suggestion is made that Nibbana can be meaningful even if we leave aside the doctrines of karma and rebirth. I think there are some modernist interpretations of Buddhist Nibbana. They try to show that these doctrines are not actually essential to the Buddhist teaching. You can leave aside this doctrine of karma and rebirth and talk about liberation. There are many modern Western Buddhists. They actually have a lot of appreciation of Buddhism, but they try to interpret the Buddhist teaching in this manner, saying that what matters is how to make this immediate life free of sorrow and suffering, free of all kinds of disturbances, psychological disturbances, unsettled states of mind, mental insanity. So it is possible to attain some kind of appeasement of all these disturbances in this life itself. But however, we see that the traditional Buddhist point of view that is expressed in the Suttantapitaka actually considers Nibbana as a very significant goal to be attained, because this problem of unsatisfactoriness does not end with the present life. It has a continuity. It has had a long past, and we have brought over some of our dispositional traits that make it go on in a kind of unending future as well, if we don't understand this process and do something about it in order to end this process of suffering. So there may be a sense in which the attempt to gain stability and calmness is useful in this immediate life. But from the perspective of early Buddhism, that is the standpoint that we come across in the Suttantapitaka, Nibbana becomes really meaningful when the reality of a continued process of births and deaths is admitted. So, in Buddhist sources, it is expressed as a kind of persistent suffering. It's a kind of unending suffering which continues into a future birth, which has come down to us from a past existence. As the Buddha says, this cyclic process has no known beginning. Anamataggo ayang sansaro. Ubba koti na panyayati. It is not possible to find an absolute beginning to this. And it will go on if we do not wisely understand it and try to do something about it. So Nibbana is actually the stopping of this process. It is the putting an end to this unending process that goes on. This view of continuity was admitted by many teachers of the Buddha's time. So it was not only the Buddha who admitted that there is a continued process of becoming, that there is a rebirth. But of course, the Buddha's explanation of the mechanics of it was different. According to the pre-Buddhist teachers, they conceived the process in terms of a substantial self that gets reincarnated in a new body and continues to exist. The Buddha did not admit the existence of such a reincarnating absolute essence called the self. According to the Buddha, it is something that is produced by causes and conditions. And a very good simile that the Buddha used, we could call it a very apt simile, a very meaningful simile that the Buddha used to describe this process. He used this simile when he was teaching a person named Vachagotta. That is the simile of the fire. Now, when we take into consideration something like a fire, we see something before us and we do not know where it came from and where it will go in the end when it's extinguished. The Buddha explained that a fire comes into existence when the elements necessary for its existence come into being. That is, the fire is dependent on the fuel that is continuously provided. And if it is possible to remove the fuel, to put an end to the fuel, the fire will go out. And then it wouldn't be even meaningful to ask the question, in which direction did the fire go? This is what the Buddha taught in the Aggi Vachagotta Sutta to the Brahmin named Vachagotta. This Brahmin named Vachagotta listened to the Buddha's teaching, and he very much appreciated the Buddha's teaching about the extinction of what the Buddha called the corruptions, asavakkaya, the extinction of the pollutants, the elimination of the inflowing taints. That is what the Buddhist tradition called asavakkaya. And asavakkaya is equivalent to Nibbana. Nibbana in this life itself. When all the inflowing taints are removed, that means we have attained Nibbana. We have attained Nibbana in this life itself. So, I mentioned about the two extremes, that it is not to be understood as a soul attaining eternal existence, nor is it to be understood as a complete annihilation of an existent being. Rather, it is to be understood as the attainment of appeasement of the unwholesome tendencies in us. It is usually seen in the tradition as an attainment that has to be understood at two levels. An attainment that has to be understood at two levels. The person who attains it is considered to be a really worthy person. Whoever attains Nibbana in this life itself is considered as a really worthy person. That is why he is called an Arahat. Araha. Araha means he is a worthy person. His value is recognized. Value in the sense of our ethical appreciation or moral appreciation of the person. He becomes an Arahat or Araha due to the fact that he has gone through a radical transformation. That is what amounts to Nibbana. Nibbana is this radical transformation. It is actually the end product of this radical transformation that a person goes through. And this transformation is recognized as a consequence of the extinction of what Buddhism describes as the extinction of asava. Asava, which I described as corruptions. Some people translate it as taints, I would like to call it the inflowing impurities, the things that flow into the mind. Without ourselves being unable to check them, to control them. They are like swift flowing floods. They sort of wash us away without being aware of their potential and power. We become actually victims of this flow of what are called taints that flow into our mind. I believe the Madhupindika Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, which is translated as the honeycomb discourse of the Buddha, which actually is very meaningful discourse of the Buddha. In this discourse, it is pointed out that a certain process takes place due to the fact that we possess these 6 senses. That is, eye, ear, nose, tongue, the body, physical body, and the mind. What happens is that, as described in the Madhupindika Sutta, Chakkung cha paticca rupe cha uppajjati chakku viññānam. Depending upon the visual sense and material form, there arises visual consciousness. The coming together of these 3 gives rise to sense contact. Tinnang sangati passo. This sense contact gives rise to sensation, vedana. Then, what is sensed, yang vedeti sanjanati, that leads to the formation of conceptual thinking. That is the beginning of conceptual thinking. Then, at this stage of conceptual thinking, the dogma of the self sets in. We develop the sense of an ego, and then we get attached to these very phenomena that we have experienced, and then they begin to overwhelm us. This is how, according to the Buddhist teaching, the suffering that we go through comes into being. So, the proliferation of the mind, to which we become victims. We become victims to our own thoughts. The thoughts become automatic, and they begin to assail us. They begin to rule over us. And that is how the process of suffering is produced. So, Nibbana is understanding this mechanism through insight. It is necessary to understand this process through insight. And then abandon this tendency in us with mindfulness in such a way that this process is not allowed. And that is what Buddhism calls the attainment of Nibbana. Then that confusion that arises on the basis of a mistaken reaction to sense perception stops. So mindfulness is one of the key requirements for achieving this goal. That is why in the Suttantapitaka it is said, Yani sotani lokasmin sati tesang nivaranam. Yani sotani lokasmin. So this figurative language is used here. Sotani are the rapidly flowing floods, the floods of impure thoughts that overwhelm us. So what is the remedy for that? The remedy is the cultivation of mindfulness. So, as described in the Buddhist sources, every sense faculty that we possess leads to interaction with the external world. Chakkuna rupang disva, having seen the material form with the visual sense, what happens is piyarupe rupe sarajyati. If a certain material form appears desirable, lovely, pleasing, we get attached to it. Apyarupe rupe vyapajyati. And if something is not in accordance with our liking, we begin to hate it, to run away from it. So this twofold reaction to our sense experience, either going along with it, going along with something, clinging to something, and trying to possess something, that dominates our mind. Or else we try to run away from something, to destroy something that is not to our liking. So this process of attraction and repulsion actually affects our being. And this is the source of all our suffering and conflicts. Piyarupe rupe sarajyati, apyarupe rupe vyapajyati. Anupattita saticha vihati paritta chetaso. We live without awareness of the body, awareness of our personality, how it functions, the mechanisms involved in the reactive processes. And then what happens is that we become victims to it, and suffering arises as a result of this. So Nibbana is actually the appeasement of this process, attaining calmness without allowing this kind of turbulence, this kind of unsettled nature to arise within us. So there are instances in which the Buddha himself raises the question, what is Nibbana? Some instances in the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha questions, people say Nibbana, Nibbana. What does it mean? What is Nibbana? And he gives the explanation. It is raga khayo, dosa khayo, moha khayo. It is the extinction of passion, the extinction of greed, attachment. It is the extinction of hatred. And it is the extinction of delusion. This shows that the attainment of Nibbana involves the transformation of a person at two levels. There is a self-transformation at two levels. The one level at which this transformation occurs is what we call the emotive level. At the emotive level, what happens is that greed, passion, hatred, these unwholesome emotions are overcome. So at the emotive level, there is transformation in the sense of settling or suppressing, calming down these emotions that produce suffering within us. Now, this calming down can be achieved by various means. The Buddha recognized that it is possible to calm down this kind of excitement of these emotions called raga and dosa, or lust and hatred, that occurs within us, by cultivating certain states of mind which in some way could be seen as entering into some states of artificially created states of mind. This was well known to many teachers of the time of the Buddha. And they thought that that was the attainment of ultimate Nibbana. Now, of course, the sensualists did not perceive of any kind of Nibbana other than what they thought was attainable in this life by the gratification of sense desires. So that is what the materialists conceived as the highest happiness and the attainment of Nibbana. There were others who thought that it is possible to not to attain happiness by the gratification of these sense desires, but by suppressing them and calming them, by cultivating certain states of mind. So these were the persons who practiced certain contemplative exercises. So the Buddha himself actually went through this process. And we have in Buddhism the description of various stages of contemplative attainment, within which the happiness, the kind of satisfactory experience that we achieve, becomes finer and finer. That is, there is a progressive order of higher state of happiness, a kind of hierarchy of states of happiness that a person can achieve. So the Buddha was very well aware of this position. And he considered, as I said, the lowest form of happiness that a person can experience is the happiness derived from the gratification of sensuous pleasures. But as the Buddha explained, they give rise to much more unhappiness in the long run. So they tie us to this sansaric existence and produce unhappiness over and over again. So that is why the Buddha described it as appasadda, kama, bahudukha, bahupayasa, adinamo ettabiyo. The karmas, the sensuous desires of little delight, they produce very little delight but much suffering. And the harmful consequences of them is much more than the little delight that we experience. There are instances in which the Buddha compares such delight to the pleasure that a person derives by scratching a wound. A person, I think this teaching was given to a person named Magandhya, who thought that sense pleasure is the highest form of happiness that a person can enjoy. And Buddha points out to him that those pleasures are like the pleasures that a person suffering from a disease of the skin, like a leper, someone suffering from leprosy, he may derive temporary pleasure by scratching his wounds. But then those wounds become more infected. And in the long run, he has to suffer more and more pain as a consequence of it. So that is how the Buddha looked at the pleasures of the senses. Then he was aware of other realms in which a more refined forms of pleasure or happiness could be attained. And in this respect, he mentioned about the contemplative process of the mind, the development process of the mind through contemplation. The first jhana experience, the second jhana experience, the absorptions, the contemplative absorptions. According to the Buddha, it is only a person who has experienced these higher levels of contemplative experience who can understand the difference. A person who has experienced them will find that there is a hierarchy of experience of satisfactory, pleasurable experience. The first jhana or the first experience of contemplative absorption in the first attainment, called the first jhana, the first absorption, is more pleasurable than the pleasure experienced by sensuous gratification. Then when you come to the second contemplative absorption, that is more pleasurable than what you experience at the first contemplative absorption. And so on. The Buddha points to 8 stages of contemplative development of the mind. And there is a very high stage referred to as Neva Sanya Na Sanyayatana, a very refined state, extremely pleasant. But then the Buddha says that is also a temporary state. It is possible to attain another stage, which is called Sanya Vedayita Nirodha. You can put an end to all perception and all sensation. Then, of course, while being absorbed in this attainment of contemplative absorption, one wouldn't have experiences of pleasure or pain. But of course, when one comes out of it, one will see that one has gone through a very peaceful experience. It is something comparable to the attainment of the Nibbana experience. Nibbana after a person passes away. That would be the kind of state that one attains after one reaches Nibbana and passes away. But there is a possibility of a person living free from psychological disturbance, free from psychological turmoil, even while continuing to live in this life. That is the nature of an arahat before the final passing away into Nibbana. This is described in the Buddhist sources as the Nibbana, which is Sopadisesa. Sopadisesa Nibbana. The Nibbana with all kinds of substrata, the 5 khandhas still going on, the 5 aggregates have not ceased to be, they continue to exist. But there is no suffering for the Arahat. Now, what is the suffering that the Arahat has overcome by attaining what is called Nibbana in this life? A person who can be called really Nibbuto. Nibbuto. Actually, even the term Parinibbana is used in the suttas in that sense. It is said, Parinibbutoso Bhagava Parinibbānāya Dhammang Deseti. The exalted one, the Bhagava, who has attained Parinibbāna. Now, that is not a reference to Buddha's final passing away, although the term Parinibbāna is used. Parinibbutoso Bhagava, the exalted one, who has actually calmed down in every way. That is what it means there. In this life itself, he has calmed all unsatisfactory experiences in every way. Parinibbutoso Bhagava, the exalted one who has calmed down unsatisfactory experiences in every way. Parinibbānāya Dhammang Deseti. He teaches the Dhamma in order that other persons also can attain this calming of unsatisfactoriness or the settling down of unsatisfactoriness in every way. Parinibbānāya Dhammang Deseti. So this is very important, that this attainment is not to be considered as an attainment to be achieved after one passes away. It is to be attained here and now. And once it is attained here and now, it can be described as the highest form of blissful experience, happy experience that one can attain. So it is in this context that the Buddha's recognition of various levels of happiness matters. So I mentioned about the Buddha's reference to the recognition of a hierarchy of levels of happiness. And in this hierarchy of levels of happiness, I mentioned that sensuous happiness that we experience through the gratification of sense desires can be conceived as the lowest level. And in the hierarchy, the attainment of each higher level of contemplative absorption brings about a higher experience of happiness. But the Buddha did not want to recommend those attainments as the ultimate goal for his disciples, because he recognized that they are all temporary states of being. One may be able to attain, according to the Buddhist concept of rebirth, a certain state of being which corresponds to the level of contemplative attainment that one has cultivated in this life. But yet, that is not a solution to the problem of impermanence and suffering. Even after that attainment, the possibility of falling back is there. So according to the Buddha, these contemplative attainments, although they may be considered as providing experience which is characterizable as happy experience, those experiences do not last forever. One is liable to fall from those attainments. And then the repeated, the continuing process of suffering can bother a person. So that is why the Buddha considered Nibbana in the sense of total eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion as the ultimate liberation of a person. So, according to the Buddha, there is no happiness which is higher than the happiness of Nibbana. Nibbana sukha parang natti. There is no happiness which is higher than the happiness of Nibbana. Now, I would like also to make some remarks on the nature of Nibbana, the nature of happiness in Nibbana, the kind of happiness that is experienced in Nibbana. So is this a kind of happiness within which one does not suffer bodily pain, bodily disease, sickness? Now, I think it is in this sense that two levels of attainment or two stages of Nibbana attainment are recognized in Buddhism. That is the Nibbana attainment of the Arahat. While the Arahat lives the life in which he has attained this until the point of death. Now the Arahat who lives that life of liberation or Nibbana, the experience of Nibbana, in the life in which he has attained it, the Arahat may suffer sickness. And the Arahat will have to quench his thirst. He becomes thirsty. He becomes hungry. So he has to go in search of food to alleviate hunger. He has to look for water to quench his thirst. Now, this is not the kind of dukkha that is eliminated by the attainment of arahatship. The attainment of Nibbana as an arahat does not desensitize that person. If one has that idea about the attainment of Nibbana in this life itself, it is very important to abandon that idea. It is a false view that an arahat does not suffer bodily pain, that an arahat does not experience bodily sickness. In fact, the Buddha himself had to suffer bodily pains, sickness. He also had to go through these processes. He's towards the end of his life, complains of being thirsty and asks Ananda to bring water to quench his thirst. Then he complains sometimes of a pain in his back, and he wants Sariputta to take over the teaching, or Ananda to take over, because he was suffering from bodily pains. So the attainment of Nibbana in this life itself refers to the elimination of suffering only at the level of mental suffering, psychological suffering. It is the psychological suffering that is ended. Now, I think this is connected also with the experience of pain and pleasure. We cannot say that the Arahant, as I said, becomes desensitized, and the Arahat is incapable of experiencing pain and pleasure. It is not so. In the ordinary waking life of the Arahat, or even in the case of the Buddha, pain and pleasure related to the body were experienced. And there is a very relevant description about the Arahat's openness to the possibility of feeling the pleasure of tasting something. Now, supposing an Arahat is given something that is sweet or pleasant of pleasant flavor, the Arahat would experience that flavor. He has not become desensitized, as I said earlier. The only difference between the Arahat, a person who has attained the realization of Nibbana, this calmness, the difference is that in the case of such a person, he experiences the flavor of something, but he doesn't experience the passion that accompanies that experience. In ordinary people who have not attained this freedom of mind, they experience also the passion, the attachment to the sweet flavor of something. Rasa raga patisangvedi. In the case of the Arahant, he is rasa patisangvedi, but he is not rasa raga patisangvedi. That is an important distinction that one has to recognize. Now, I would like to turn towards another interesting point regarding Nibbana. That is regarding Nibbana and truth. Is it possible to say, with reference to the Buddhist concept of Nibbana, as stated in the Pali Suttas, that it is the only truth that the Buddha recognized? We are aware that the Buddha recognized Nibbana as something true. That is quite all right. But did he recognize Nibbana as the only truth? That is, denying everything else in this world as illusory? I don't think this is true of early Buddhism. The Buddhism that is represented in the Pali Suttas. I would like to make some clarification about that point. The Suttantapitaka says that Nibbana is viewed by the noble ones as true. Nibbana is viewed by the noble ones as true. Because all other things that are repeatedly and constantly imagined to be stable are subject to change. So in the case of the noble ones, Arya Puggalas, Nibbana is viewed as the most stable, the true that we can experience. So this is expressed by a certain verse that is found in the Suttantapitaka. Yena yena hi manyanti tena tang hoti anyata. So whatever people begin to grasp with imaginative thinking, thinking that they are stable things, they find that they become subject to change. Yena yena manyanti tena tang hoti anyata. So actually the dependence on them as the sources of real happiness, it is not actually proper. One cannot depend on them as stable objects of happiness. Yena yena hi manyanti tena tang hoti anyata. Then the Buddha says, amosa dhammang nibbanam. Amosa dhamma. What does amosa dhamma means? It is not a deceptive thing. Nibbana is not a deceptive thing. It doesn't produce expectations in your mind and shatter those expectations. Whereas everything else that we pursue in the beginning produces many expectations in us. Aspirations, expectations, but finally, we find that they are all contaminated by their harmful consequences, the adinam. They have adinam, harmful consequences. And we get disgusted with them. So, in the case of Nibbana, the Buddha says, Amosa dhammang Nibbana. Amosa dhammang Nibbana. Nibbana is not something that is deceptive, not a musa dhamma. Musa is lie. It's not a lie. It is not something that deceives us. Therefore, the noble ones see that as the truth. Tadariya sacchato vidu. The noble ones see Nibbana as the truth. Now here, I think it is important to draw your attention to something that the Buddha emphasizes in one of the sections in the Suttantapitaka called the Atthakavagga. In the Atthakavagga, the Buddha is not very favorable towards the attempt on the part of various teachers who lived at that time to elevate something as the highest truth. That is actually characterized by the tendency to cling to something as this is the only truth. Ida meva satcham. This only is the truth. Ida meva satcham moga manyam. Everything else is false. Everything else is empty. The Buddha does not encourage this. And in the Atthakavagga of the Suttantapitaka, the Buddha repeatedly emphasizes this idea of not clinging to anything as the absolute truth. So, in this context, the Buddha is questioned by someone regarding what the Buddha's notion about truth is. Does the Buddha affirm a single truth as the truth that has to be accepted by everyone? Is he actually teaching some kind of absolute truth that has to be accepted by everyone? The Buddha gives a very qualified answer to this question. And I think it is important for us to look closely at the Buddha's answer to this question. I will give you the Pali version of the Buddha's answer. It is, the Buddha says, Ekang hi satchang na dutiya matti yasmin paja no vivade pajanam. Ekang hi satchang na dutiya matti yasmin paja no vivade pajanam. Now, there is an attempt on the part of even Buddhist scholars to interpret this as saying or as having the meaning that the Buddha actually taught just one truth, that he denied truthfulness to everything else. He taught only one truth. That is the truth about Nibbana. But this is not what this verse means. What this verse means, and it was actually uttered in a context in which there was a lot of debates and conflicts among teachers. They were fighting each other, claiming that their own viewpoint is the true one. In this context, the Buddha points out, there is one thing that is true. One thing that is true. Ekang hi satcham. And there is no second. Na dutiya matti. In which Yasmin, Paja means the people of the world. Pajano. Pajano means understanding which. Understanding which no vivade. Pajanam. Pajanam means knowing which they would not come to conflict. That is this truth about the calming of the mind, Nibbana. If one has attained, the Buddha actually characterized it as a true state. It is a true attainment. People can verify it. People can see that it is true. He didn't insist that there are other things in the world that people can see to be true. There may be many ordinary situations in which people can talk about something being true. The Buddha did not reject those truths, the various truths that people who possess 6 senses to observe the world and to establish a situation as being true. The Buddha did not deny that there is a possibility of speaking about truth in various situations that we come across in our day-to-day intercourse in life. But he said, there is one truth which is very important to understand, very important to know. That is the truth relating to Nibbana. Because there is no other truth that puts an end to conflicts and disputes. When one understands this truth about the calming of mind, one will not get entangled in conflicts and disputes. It is the truth which, when realized, puts an end to all conflicts and disputes. So that is a very significant statement of the Buddha. This does not mean that there aren't any other truths in the world. There can be many truths, scientific truths, empirical truths. The Buddha did not challenge them, and he did not try to reduce everything to the truth of Nibbana. That, I think, has been misinterpreted even by many Buddhist scholars. Now, this is a kind of interpretation that I am inclined to give, and if there is any criticism of it, I would call upon anyone to raise their objections. Now, I would like to go into a kind of recapitulation of what we have discussed. And I would like to present some of the observations that persons who are committed to the Brahmanical standpoint about truth and ultimate liberation, how they have conceived Buddhist Nibbana. There is a very famous Indian scholar who actually has written a lot about Indian philosophy. I think he is a very renowned Indian scholar, a late Indian scholar. He has passed away now, but he contributed immensely to the knowledge of Indian philosophical traditions, including Buddhism. However, I wish to note that he, in his interpretation of Buddhist Nibbana, has committed an error. That is my judgment about certain statements that he had made about Nibbana. So here, I wish to make these comments about this person, S. Radhakrishnan. I wish to note that an important difference between the Buddhist concept of Nibbana and certain other religious concepts, in terms of which an attempt is made to give meaning to the religious pursuits of human beings, is that the Buddhist concept can be understood purely in ethical and psychological terms. It is a concept that can be understood purely in ethical and psychological terms. One can leave aside all metaphysical and mystical associations in interpreting the Buddhist concept of Nibbana. So this is something that I am saying with emphasis, that we need to leave aside all metaphysical and mystical associations with the Buddhist concept of Nibbana. In the Vedanta teaching, the culmination of the religious life is believed to be realization of the identity of the Atman with Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. So the Atman is also conceived as a byproduct of Brahman. And ultimate liberation from their point of view consists in finding identity with that ultimate absolute being, Brahman. So in Judeo-Christian religion, ultimate liberation consists in attaining heavenly bliss, joining with God in heaven. So Buddhism has none of this. That is a point that we should understand. In the Vedanta teaching, the culmination of the religious life is believed to be realization of the identity of the Atman with Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. According to this doctrine, the explanation for all existence is itself Brahman. In Buddhism, Nibbana is not conceived anywhere as the primordial and infinite being from which the transient and finite things of the world have been produced. So Nibbana is not a kind of being which has produced the world or other things. That is why I emphasize the point that Nibbana is a term derived from a verbal usage, not from a noun, but from a verb, not from a substantive linguistic form. Buddhism explains existence in terms of its principle of dependent arising. So that is very central to Buddhism. Dependent arising. Things arise dependently. So Nibbana is conceived neither as the source of ourselves, nor as the eternal being with which we finally merge at the end of our religious pursuit to enjoy blissful eternal life. But this is how some modern writers attempted to explain the Buddhist concept of Nibbana. It is in this context that I refer to Radhakrishnan's view of Nibbana. Radhakrishnan, for instance, interprets Nibbana entirely in terms of the metaphysics of Vedanta philosophy. And I believe that Buddhism does not conform to this philosophical viewpoint. It moves away from it. So I shall quote Radhakrishnan's view only to point out that that is an erroneous, wrong view. He says, Nibbana is timeless existence. And so Buddha must admit the reality of a timeless self. So a concept that the Buddha attempted all his lifetime to reject, the kind of absolute self-essence, an eternal self. Radhakrishnan is trying to put that view to the Buddha. That is a very wrong attempt. So he says, Nibbana is timeless existence. And so Buddha must admit the reality of a timeless self. There is a being at the back of all life, which is unconditioned, above all empirical categories, something which does not give rise to any effect and is not the effect of anything else. So this is what he says in Indian Philosophy, Volume 1, page 452. Mm. Then he continues in another place. Well, before this statement that I quoted, he makes these remarks about Nibbana. Nibbana is an eternal condition of being, for it is not a sanskara, or what is made or put together, which is impermanent. It continues while its expressions change. This is what lies behind the skandhas, which are subject to birth and decay. The illusion of becoming is founded on the reality of nirvana. Buddha does not attempt to define it, since it is the root principle of all, and so is indefinable. Now, this is, I think, not in accordance with the Buddha's concept of Nibbana. The Buddha described Nibbana. He said it is the elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion. But then Radhakrishnan would say that these are all negative expressions of the nature of Nibbana. The Buddha does not give any positive description of Nibbana. That is also not true. The Buddha described Nibbana as purity. It is the culmination of a person's purity, the inner purity of a person. And the Buddhist tradition has talked about the gradual attainment of this culmination of purity. I think if you look at one of the suttas, which talks about it is called I forget really the name of the sutta in this instance, but it is a description given by a monk named Punna Mantani Putta. Punna Mantani Putta. The discourse is found in the Majjhima Nikaya, where it is said that the ultimate attainment can be called Anupada Parinibbana. Anupada Parinibbana. That means the total extinction of taints in such a way that they do not arise again. And according to this sutta, this process of attaining Anupada Parinibbana goes through 7 stages. And they are called 7 kinds of Visuddhi. The sutta is Rathavinita Sutta. Rathavinita Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. So it is said that the final Suddhi that leads to Anupada Parinibbana has to go through 7 stages. And the 7 stages are described as, actually Buddhaghosa has written a sort of extensive commentary on these 7 stages. It is called Sila Visuddhi, the purity of moral conduct. Chitta Visuddhi, the purity of mind. Then Ditthi Visuddhi, the purity of viewpoint, the view that one holds. Kankha Vitarana Visuddhi, that is the purity which removes one's uncertainties, the removal of uncertainties, the purity that comes from the removal of uncertainties. Then Magga Magga Jnana Dassana Visuddhi, the purity that shows the distinction between the right way and the wrong way, Magga and Amagga. And the 6th one, Patipada Jnana Dassana Visuddhi, the purity that shows the right path. Then finally, Jnana Dassana Visuddhi, the purity of knowledge and vision. So it is by attaining the purity of knowledge and vision that final Nibbana is supposed to be attained. So Nibbana can be considered as the culmination of a process of purification. So there is something very positive in Nibbana. It can be called the highest purity that one attains. And there is another sutta that I would like to mention in this context. That is the Magandhya Sutta. Magandhya Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. It's one of the suttas that comes towards the end of the first volume of the Majjhima Nikaya in the PTS edition. The Buddha calls Nibbana health, arogya. Arogya. And it is in this sense that the Buddha connects Nibbana with health of the mind. And also the Buddhist tradition talks about 2 kinds of disease. Cetasika roga and Kayika roga. Venerable Sariputta made this distinction very clearly. And in the Magandhya Sutta, the Buddha speaks of Nibbana as arogya. Nibbana is called freedom from disease. And in the Sangyutta Nikaya also it's called health, arogya. Sariputta once pointed out that it is possible for a person to be healthy in mind in spite of having a sick body. So these are some of the positive aspects that we can point to in Nibbana. So the idea that it is the Parama Sukha is something very positive. although there is no sensation involved, no working of the senses to produce it, it is considered as avedayita sukha, the happiness that transcends all kinds of sensation. So here I conclude my presentation and hope you have clearly understood what I presented, and I would like to call upon any of those present to raise any questions that you might have regarding this discussion.
Thank you,
Anything that needs
Professor,
further clarification.
for your lecturing to our student here. May anyone have a question? Anyone have question?
No questions?
Professor, no question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the Professor Dr. Premasiri from the SIBA or Sri Lanka International from Candy SIBA. So now we are together praying homework together. Please. Alahang Sambuddho Bhag Buddha Sawakato Tathamo Dhammang Namasa Supatipan Wakasangko Sangkhang Namani Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So thank you very much for your patient listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, and who are online and on site together here. We will meet again on
Okay,
23rd
23rd of
20 of August in this
August.
month. Okay, I will give lecture from the Jingche Buddhist Sangha University
Mm,
from Taiwan.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.